Wendy gently tapped on Nanola's noggin, assuring her that everything would turn out all right. Mr. Pine, anxious about his daughter's condition, clutched onto Nanola's hand, pledging to stay by her side no matter what. Meanwhile, Roland and Lightning tried their best to lift Nanola's spirits. Lightning regaled her with tales of daring adventures, while Roland attempted to dazzle her with a coin trick that was simply magical. Nanola's eyes met Anna's, who approached her with a tenderness that warmed her heart. Anna whispered soothing words, promising that everyone would be there for her. A soft peck on Nanola's forehead sealed the deal. As time marched on, the group lost themselves in time. The night passed uneventfully, and even Nightingale, with her keen sense of magic, detected no abnormalities in Nanola's core. Suddenly, a rooster's crow pierced the air, signaling the arrival of a new day. Roland swept open the curtains, allowing a brilliant shaft of sunshine to flood the room. Nanola stirred, roused from her slumber by the morning's radiance. The group breathed a collective sigh of relief, ecstatic that Nanola had made it through the first day of awakening. Wendy's heart swelled with hope as she gazed at Roland. She believed he held the key to a brighter future for their fellow witch sisters, and she pleaded with him to spread the word far and wide. Roland's nod of agreement set her mind at ease. He had already been formulating a plan of action. He predicted that once the month of the demons had passed, the townsfolk would be more accepting of witches. He intended to dispatch the news as a form of rumors. He knew all too well that if he openly recruited witches, the kingdom would erupt in chaos. But Roland was nothing if determined. He swore an oath that one day he would overthrow the church and ascend to the throne. That was when the winds of change would truly sweep across the land, transforming the witch's fate for good. Wendy felt a thrill of anticipation. It was a dangerous, audacious goal, but if anyone could pull it off, it was Roland. She pledged to stand by him every step of the way. As the group of soldiers stood before the frozen lake, their talk revolved around the massive ship that Roland was constructing. The introduction of the cannon had given rise to a new branch, and while the flintlock team had been rehearsing ceaselessly for days, the newly created cannon team had yet to fire a single projectile. Varner couldn't help but ponder the true purpose of the cannon. He weighed the sheer heft of the weapon in his mind, wondering if its only utility was for defending walls against the demonic beasts. However, he swiftly pushed that notion aside. There had to be more to it. And then, as if a bolt of lightning had struck him, he thought of the ship that His Highness was building. There had to be a deeper significance to it all. Later that afternoon, on the western fringes of the border town, Axe was busy assembling the cannon team in preparation for its maiden firing. It seemed that there was some friendly rivalry between the team members, likely due to the extra 5 silver offered to those on the cannon team. Once Roland had finalized the team members, he was eager to move on to the next phase, testing the new concrete ship which he named Little Town. All that remained was to complete the construction of the ship, apply an anti-corrosion treatment, and build a platform for Wendy to control the winds. Wendy had been tirelessly practicing her wind manipulation skills in the garden for days now, and Roland had appointed his most trusted knight, Carter, as the captain of the little town. With a resounding boom, the cannon team successfully fired its first projectile, and Roland knew that a thrilling new journey lay ahead. With the ship finally completed and the crew assembled, Roland had carefully selected his most trusted men to assume positions on the vessel. Carter, the seasoned knight, was appointed captain, Mr. Pine as the messenger, and Lightning as navigator. Lightning was ecstatic at the prospect of testing out the new concrete ship, the likes of which she had never seen before. She was fascinated by how the sail was made out of all types of animal hide. As the crew worked to prepare the vessel, Lightning took her position and shouted, "Raise the sail and set sail." However, their lack of experience was immediately evident. Carter had no idea what was going on, and Brian, who had been appointed helmsman, was unsure how to perform a hard right rudder. Confused and questioning how many times he should turn to the right, Lightning had to intervene and correct Brian, telling him to turn the helm all the way to the left. Seeing Brian's confusion, Lightning let out a sigh and took the helm herself. As the ship finally sailed steadily, Lightning bellowed toward Wendy, signaling her to unleash her ability. A grin spread across Wendy's face as she positioned herself for the task at hand. Memories of her conversation with Roland flooded her mind, in which he had urged her to keep honing her ability until she can fully control her ability like Nightingale and Anna. However, Wendy had struggled to control her powers before arriving at the border town. In the past, she had only managed to use them to dry meat or sheets. But now, with a determined look in her eyes, she took a deep breath and whipped her wrist, conjuring a powerful gust of wind that propelled the ship forward. The crew gaped in amazement at her impressive feat, marveling at Roland's incredible talent for transforming stones into a seaworthy vessel. As time passed, Lightning's expert guidance helped Brian master the art of steering the ship, much to the crew's admiration. Wendy had been pushing herself to the limit, channeling her magical powers to their fullest extent, but it was taking a toll on her body. She had never used her abilities for such a prolonged period, and now, as the ship drew closer to the shore, she was struggling to keep going. Despite her best efforts, Wendy collapsed, her face turning a ghastly shade of purple, a clear sign of frostbite. Lightning sprang into action, swooping down to scoop up the stricken Wendy from the high tower. Her hair and clothes were frozen stiff, and the crew gathered anxiously around her, checking her condition. Carter wasted no time in giving orders, directing the ship towards the safety of the shore. However, the vessel collided with the river bank, causing everyone to jolt forward. Thankfully, the ship emerged unscathed. Carter urged Lightning to swiftly transport Wendy to the safety of the castle while the rest of the crew stayed behind to gather the sails. The first test of the little town could not be deemed a complete failure, but it was far from a resounding success. Carter concluded that they would need to work on how to keep Wendy warm and work more on their anti-collision. As the snowflakes cascaded down from the leaden skies, a carriage trundled its way into a small town up north. Inside the carriage, a stern-looking pastor who was whipping a young girl. The child's sobs seemed to irritate him, and he threatened her with dire consequences if she didn't quieten down. The coachman glanced back, silently thanking the heavens for the pastor's intervention. Without him, the poor orphans wouldn't have survived the harsh winter. Moments later, the pastor barked orders at the coachman, instructing him to keep driving. Suddenly, the coachman asked the pastor if the orphans were from the Wolfheart Kingdom. The pastor confirmed that most of them were and that only a few of the orphans would be taken in by the church due to the scarcity of food. He praised the coachman for his hard work and abruptly ended the conversation. The coachman was being paid a princely sum of 20 silver coins for transporting the orphans. Hours later, they arrived at a motel where the pastor greeted two men and asked them to choose a girl. The coachman watched on from the window, knowing exactly what the pastor had planned, but he didn't seem to care. Bishop Maines strode into a curious building that resembled a massive naturally formed sinkhole. It was so vast that he always wondered if this was a gift from God. The cathedral was built atop the sinkhole, acting as a symbol of the holy building. Within the sinkhole, and the real heart of the church lay hidden within. After a few moments, Maine reached the bottom, where two black armored soldiers from the punishment army guarded the entrance. An officer welcomed Maine at the door. The officer is one of many loyal soldiers who lived here and dedicated their lives to protecting the church's secrets. Maine's destination was the prison area, where the church detained their enemies, criminals, and even innocent people. Upon hearing Maine's arrival, anguished screams and cries echoed throughout the prison. The prisoners pleaded to be released, or even to be put out of their misery. Maine strode towards a gate, which he unlocked before instructing the guard to remain outside. He closed the door behind him and entered the cell, alone. As Maine looked at the frail figure imprisoned in the tiny cell, he acted a pang of sympathy for the man. The man trapped inside had suffered greatly during his long captivity, with his gaunt face and sunken eyes telling a story of neglect and despair. Maine tried to offer some small comfort to the man, telling him that the church had been providing him with the finest meals, all made standards in accordance with the king. Turned out, the man imprisoned behind the cell was no other than the king of the Grey Castle, Roland's father, Majesty Wimbledon III, but the king's thoughts were not on his comfort but on the fate of his family. He eagerly questioned Maine about the whereabouts and well-being of his children, but the news was not good. The eldest son, Gerald, had been executed by his second son, Timothy, beheaded on charges of treason and assassination of the king. The third daughter, Garcia, had declared independence in the south and declared as the queen and was now locked in a bitter war with her brother Timothy for control of the kingdom. As for Roland, and the youngest daughter Maine had little information to offer. It was clear, however, that the once great kingdom of Grey Castle was in turmoil, with civil war looming on the horizon. As the terrible news sank in, the old king's worn face betrayed his disbelief. He couldn't fathom the legitimacy of the story. Bishop Maine, however, had more to reveal. Bishop Maine said few words, he said. Fight for the throne. One that had assigned each of the king's children a territory and set them against each other, vying for control. At end of the 5-year term, whoever came on top will become the new king. Maine revealed that the church had masterminded this scheme, which left the old king with a deep sense of pain and betrayal. Suddenly, the old king's memories came flooding back. He remembered the day of his kidnapping, the day of the church's prayers. They had brought him to a chamber and stripped him of his clothes and his god locket. The church had used a witch to replace him, taking control of the kingdom and building their churches in every town. As the old king tried to process the shocking information, his mind raced with questions. Why would his children turn on each other? How could the church be so cruel as to force them into a fight for the throne? He couldn't understand why they would choose such a violent path when they could have taken over the kingdom slowly and quietly. Tears streamed down his face as he became more emotionally agitated, coughing and struggling to speak. Meanwhile, Maine just looked at the old king, his face twisted in a sneer of disdain. He revealed that the king's children may not be as noble and united as he had thought. The king's third daughter, Garcia, had been secretly building her army for years, with the sole purpose of overthrowing the true successor, Gerald, the first prince, and placing herself on the throne. Maine went on to explain that this wasn't just happening to the old king, it was happening in the other 3 kingdoms as well. The church was determined to gain total control over the land and eliminate any opposition and completely remove the royal family from their roots, and become the sole ruling power of the land. Despite Maine's attempt to comfort the old king with the knowledge that he wasn't alone in his suffering, the truth was crushing. The church's ruthless plan had thrown the kingdom into chaos, pitting families against each other and tearing the land apart. Maine divulged all that the old monarch yearned to know, but the moment had arrived to terminate the king's existence. The withering gaze of the old ruler focused on Bishop Maine's countenance as his voice faded away. With his final breath, he cursed Maine and the entire church, damning them to the fiery abyss and rot in hell. Soon after, the old king succumbed and collapsed onto the cold, hard ground. Unperturbed, Maine's heartless demeanor showed no signs of remorse as he exited the prison cell, leaving behind the remnants of the monarch's legacy as if nothing of consequence had occurred. The once mighty ruler had been reduced to a frail. Meanwhile, in the Witch Association's encampment, the witches bore witness to the deaths of 2 more of their comrades during the becoming of age ceremony. The loss of these 2 lives only added to the despair felt by those who survived the initial encounter with the demons. With dwindling supplies and no guarantee of survival through the harsh winter, the witches were left feeling hopeless and uncertain about their future. Just then, a figure stumbled into the campsite, bruised and battered, and collapsed onto the ground. It was Leaf, the only survivor of the group that had ventured out into the wilderness. She had used her magical abilities to fashion clothing made of plant material, which helped to protect her from the frigid snow and biting wind. Due to the frostbite, Leaf had some of her toes removed. As Leaf recovered from her injuries, her fellow witches gathered around her. One of the older girls suggested that Leaf take the place of their mentor and become their new leader, as she was the only one among them with any fighting ability. After a moment of contemplative silence, Leaf agreed with the proposal. But she knew that they couldn't stay in the encampment for long. They needed to find Nightingale. Upon hearing Leaf's suggestion of searching for the Nightingale, the group dispersed in trepidation. They were uncertain whether the Nightingale could be trusted, and whether the border town was as safe as she had claimed it to be. Wendy and the Nightingale might have already met their demise within the town's confines. Leaf declared that she would be the first to assess the situation, while the others would wait outside the town and search for a secure location. If the Nightingale was lying, Leaf would take on the mantle of leadership. However, if Leaf were to perish within the town, Scroll, the eldest girl in the group, would have to step up and take on the leadership role. Although Scroll was hesitant, Leaf reassured her that combat and fighting were not necessary for leadership. She knew that Scroll had the same courage as Wendy, being one of the earliest members of their association. Scroll then inquired about what would happen if the Nightingale's words proved true. After a moment of contemplation, Leaf replied that if Nightingale was indeed telling the truth, then they might have just stumbled upon their true holy mountain in the border town.